Hi guys, my name is Chris. I wanted to talk to you about the ADA Act of 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act, and its implications on the fire service today. So, just very broadly from the beginning, the Americans with Disability Act essentially requires employers, regardless of the field, to make reasonable accommodations for prospective hires or candidates and employees who may be injured on the job or have gone through the hiring process or hired, um, and are now part of the organization. The ADA applies to the hiring process. So if there's issues with testing, they have to make reasonable accommodations for those issues throughout the hiring process, and then also for them to meet their job requirements during their employment. So for the fire service, the text discusses a bunch of things in terms of ADA and the fire service. The fire service, probably with other emergency services like law enforcement, EMS, you know, nursing, especially the emergency type of nursing, those sort of emergency responder positions. There's there's already a pretty high standard of physical and mental capability to get those jobs initially. So FES agencies don't really have to deal with the ADA stuff as much as like 9 to 5, the traditional 9 to 5 kind of business environment, because our jobs have physical demands that are required as minimum standards to meet to get the jobs and to maintain those jobs. The biggest issue that FES agencies run into in terms of ADA is transitioning from an injury or disability that has occurred after employment, especially when it has to do when the causation has something to do that happened during employment, during you performing routine job functions, and then transitioning that employee to where they can still work in the agency and maintain their same level of pay and benefits, and not just immediately, but in the future as well. So one of the things they talk about is accessibility is probably one of the biggest issues FES agencies deal with initially, um, in terms of what you and I would see, every day in our fire stations. They have to be accessible. The handicap ramps, the shower stalls, living quarters on the appropriate floors, or having access to the living quarters if they're on, second and third floor living quarters above the bays. It has to be elevators and stuff like that. Everything has to be compliant, ADA compliant, just like any other business. Just like when we do a fire inspection, just like when a contractor does a building inspection, ADA does an inspection as well, or is involved in the contractor, more in the building side, to make sure everything's compliant prior to anybody housing the structure. But not to go too far too fast or anything, but ADA and its implications on FES. So one of the biggest issues that I've seen in my career and that I wanted to mention in this is not so much the hiring process, but when guys get hurt on the job, girls get hurt on the job, how do we maintain their livelihood after that? And there's kind of a double-edged sword I notice with a lot of agencies, at least in Florida where I'm at, is we have the inspection prevention side of the agency. So you have inspectors who, in one organization I worked for, and that's popular in the county that I'm in, are high-risk inspectors. They promote off the floor to prevention, and then they become full-time inspectors. Their schedule changes. They work a 40-hour work week, but they still maintain their Fire 1 and Fire 2 certification and the other certifications they had along the way to keep them in the high-risk bracket. And they don't necessarily count for manning, but they could, So when you're trying to kind of build your manning sheets and your staffing for ISO grading and stuff like that, it's a benefit in that sense. But it's a risk in the other sense that you want to maintain this high risk status for FRS for your pension. So if you, through collective bargaining agreements, union CBAs, if you hold those positions, those prevention inspection positions, PIOs, pub eds, all those sort of positions for high risk employees to promote to off the floor, what you do is you take away an opportunity for somebody who may develop a disability physically or mentally over time, who needs to transition to one of those spots. You take that opportunity away from them to transition to. So then, how do you mitigate, or how do you make them functional in their existing job? And unfortunately for us in FES, that's where we generate a lot of liability. Is if we can't move them laterally to a different position um, with different job functions that they can actually perform depending on their level of disability, then we create liability for us in terms of not being able to satisfy ADA requirements without making reasonable accommodations. So, not being a union buster or anything like that, but just a consideration for planning down the road for FES agencies is to um, the guys who have those civilian positions use civilian inspectors, PIO, PubEd, plans review, all those sort of things. Even if you have your own investigation department for arson and stuff like that, if you can have those positions um, where they're not certified, not fire certified, at least for firefighter 1 and firefighter 2, and their job description doesn't incorporate that same skill set, then they go in the low risk category for FRS, but they can, in most instances, perform those job functions where they couldn't on the line in fire. So just a consideration. Um, I hope you'll think about it and maybe kind of review your department structure and apply it. I think it's a great way to protect ourselves and give guys and girls on the floor opportunities to move in case something happens. So good luck to everybody. See you. Thanks.